They pleaded for mercy, and the monsters of Earth answered the cry. Across the stars, the transmission arrived on a Tuesday morning, though such human measurements of time meant nothing to the beings who sent it. Deep within the Atacama Observatory's quantum receiver array, the signal began as a whisper among the cosmic noise, then grew into something that made every technician in the facility stop what they were doing and listen. Dr. Marcus Webb had been monitoring deep space frequencies for 17 years. He had cataloged nebula emissions, tracked pulsar rhythms, and documented the background hum of the universe itself, but he had never heard anything like the sound that came through his equipment at precisely 0900 hours. It was a voice, distorted by impossible distance and quantum interference, but unmistakably a voice filled with such raw desperation that it made his hands tremble as he reached for the recording controls. The translation software took 6 minutes to process the alien language into something human ears could understand. When the words finally emerged from the speakers, every person in the control room felt their blood run cold. This message is broadcast to all civilized species capable of receiving it. My name is Elder Vornak of the Kaleth Consensus. Our people are dying. Our worlds are burning. The Vraxan Dominion has declared our entire species an abomination that must be purged from existence. We have tried to negotiate. We have tried to flee. We have tried to surrender. They give us no option except extinction. The recording continued with the sound of explosions in the background, each blast marking the death of thousands. The Kaleth were traders, philosophers, and artists. Their 16 colony worlds had never raised an army or built a warship. They had believed that peaceful interaction and mutual prosperity were the foundation of galactic civilization. They had been wrong. We know most species will ignore this message. The Vraxan Dominion controls 47 star systems and commands the third largest military force in known space. No single government has the power to challenge them, and no alliance has the will to try. But we send this message anyway, because we refuse to die in silence. We refuse to let the universe forget that we existed. We refuse to accept that might makes right. Dr. Webb forwarded the transmission to the Global Defense Council within minutes of receiving it. By noon, it had reached every major government on Earth. By evening, it was being debated in emergency sessions from Beijing to Brussels, from Washington to Johannesburg. The response was predictable and disheartening. Earth had only been part of the galactic community for 8 years, ever since human scientists had cracked the mathematics of faster-than-light travel and stumbled into a universe far more crowded than anyone had imagined. In those 8 years, humanity had learned to be cautious. The galaxy was not the peaceful federation of exploration that optimistic science fiction had promised. It was a place of ancient grudges, territorial disputes, and species that viewed newer civilizations as either resources to exploit or threats to eliminate. Earth had built a modest defense fleet, trained a generation of soldiers for combat in zero gravity, and generally kept its head down while trying to establish trade relationships and diplomatic ties. The emergency session of the Global Defense Council convened in Geneva at 2300 hours. Representatives from every major nation sat around the circular table, their faces illuminated by the holographic display showing the Kaleth star systems. Admiral Sarah Okonkwo of the African Union Space Command stood at the head of the table, her posture rigid with military discipline even after 18 hours without sleep. The situation is clear, she began without preamble. The Kaleth species is facing systematic genocide. The Vraxan Dominion has already destroyed 11 of their 16 colony worlds. Intelligence estimates suggest the remaining 5 worlds have perhaps 48 hours before the Vraxan fleet completes its extermination campaign. Current Kaleth population stands at approximately 8 billion individuals. Most of them are civilians with no military training or defensive capabilities. Ambassador Chen Zhao of the Asian Coalition leaned forward in his seat. Admiral, we all understand the moral implications of what we are witnessing. But let us speak plainly about our capabilities. How many ships does the Vraxan Dominion have in the Kaleth region? Our long-range sensors indicate approximately 12,000 vessels, Okonkwo replied. They have committed roughly 30% of their total military capacity to this operation. They are taking no chances and showing no mercy. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken calculations. Earth's entire space fleet consisted of 180 vessels, most of them destroyers and frigates designed for defensive operations near human space. The idea of challenging a force that outnumbered them nearly 70-1 was not just ambitious, it bordered on suicidal. General Antonio Vargas of the South American Defense Pact spoke up, his voice carefully neutral. "Admiral, what would be our chances of success if we chose to intervene?" Okonkwo met his gaze without flinching. "In a conventional engagement following accepted rules of galactic warfare, our chances of achieving a military victory would be effectively zero. We would be destroyed within hours, possibly minutes if the Vraxan commander is competent." However, she paused, and something flickered in her eyes that made several council members shift uncomfortably in their seats. "However, I did not say our chances of success were zero. I said our chances of achieving a conventional military victory were zero. Those are not the same thing." Ambassador Yuki Tanaka of the Pacific Alliance frowned. "Admiral, please explain the distinction." Okonkwo activated a different display, this one showing historical records from Earth's own bloody past. Wars fought in trenches and jungles, cities defended street by street, resistance movements that had turned occupations into nightmares for superior forces. Humans do not fight the way other species fight. We did not evolve on a gentle world where cooperation was always the optimal strategy. We evolved on a planet that tried to kill us with diseases, predators, weather, and 1,000 other threats. We survived by being adaptable, relentless, and willing to pay terrible prices for principles we believed in. She pulled up footage from the Kaleth transmission, showing their beautiful cities being reduced to rubble by Vraxan bombardment. The Vraxan Dominion fights for territory and resources. They fight to expand their empire and demonstrate their power. They fight because they believe they are entitled to do so. But if we choose to intervene, we would be fighting for something different. We would be fighting because someone asked for help and we decided that was reason enough. The Brazilian representative, Dr. Isabella Santos, raised her hand. "Admiral, with all respect, moral conviction does not stop plasma torpedoes or defeat superior numbers. What tactical advantage could we possibly exploit?" "Psychology," Okonkwo replied simply. "The Vraxan Dominion has spent the last 3 centuries conquering weaker species. They win because their enemies fight them the way they expect to be fought, with formations and tactics and strategies designed to minimize casualties while achieving military objectives. But humans can fight differently. We can fight like we are willing to lose every single ship, if it means accomplishing our mission. We can fight like every death is acceptable as long as it serves a purpose. We can fight like the price of doing nothing is higher than the price of dying." She turned to face the full council, her voice growing harder. "The Vraxan commander will expect us to retreat when our casualties reach 20%. We will not. He will expect us to surrender when our situation becomes hopeless. We will not. He will expect us to value our own lives more than the lives of strangers 800 light-years away." He will be wrong. The debate continued for 3 more hours. Military analysts presented casualty projections that made even hardened generals pale. Diplomats warned about potential consequences from other galactic powers. Economists calculated the cost of building replacement ships and training replacement crews. But beneath all the practical objections, there was a current of something else. Something that humans had carried in their hearts since the first time one tribe had helped another survive a harsh winter or fought off a common threat. It was the simple, irrational belief that some things mattered more than survival, that mercy was not weakness, that the strong had a duty to protect the weak, even when protection was expensive or dangerous or likely to end in failure. When the final vote came, it was not unanimous. 7 nations abstained, arguing that Earth could not afford to sacrifice its defense fleet for strangers. But 43 nations voted in favor of intervention, and that was enough. Within 6 hours, every available warship was being recalled to Earth orbit. Within 12 hours, crews were being briefed on what Admiral Okonkwo was calling Operation Guardian Angel. Within 18 hours, the fleet was ready to depart. Commander James Rivera stood on the bridge of the UES Defiant, watching through the view screen as 180 human vessels arranged themselves in departure formation. He was 42 years old, a veteran of the Mars Rebellion and the Titan Defense, father of 2 daughters who would probably grow up without him. He had volunteered for this mission knowing the odds, understanding that he was likely looking at his homeworld for the last time. His communications officer, Lieutenant Sarah Kim, turned from her station with a puzzled expression. "Commander, we are receiving thousands of personal messages from Earth. Text, video, audio, all on open channels. People saying goodbye, people saying they are proud, people saying thank you. Rivera nodded slowly. Broadcast a general response. Tell them we are honored to serve. Tell them we go knowing the cost. Tell them that if humans must be judged by how we treat strangers who ask for mercy, then we choose to be judged as worthy. The fleet engaged their faster-than-light drives simultaneously, creating a cascade of blue-white light that was visible from the surface of Earth. In living rooms and public squares across the planet, people watched their defenders disappear into the darkness of space. Heading toward a battle most of them would not survive. The journey to Caleth space took 6 days of hard transit, pushing the human drives to their maximum sustainable velocity. Along the way they encountered refugee ships, dozens of them, fleeing the Vraxon advance with whatever populations they had managed to evacuate. The vessels were heavily damaged, their hulls scarred by weapons fire, their engines barely functional. Admiral Okonkwo ordered the fleet to stop and render assistance. Medical teams transferred to the refugee ships and began treating the wounded. Engineers performed emergency repairs to failing systems. Supplies were distributed to vessels that had been adrift for days without food or water. And for the first time, humans and Caleth met face to face. The Caleth were tall beings, almost skeletal in their thinness, with forearms and large eyes that could see deep into the infrared spectrum. They communicated through a combination of spoken language and subtle pheromone signals that human translators struggled to interpret accurately. But there was no mistaking the emotion in Elder Vornak's voice when he was brought aboard the Defiant and saw Admiral Okonkwo waiting to greet him. "You came," he said simply, his translator rendering the words in flat, emotionless English that could not convey the depths of feeling behind them. "We sent our message to everyone, to every species with the technology to hear it. 47 governments received our transmission. 47 civilizations listened to us beg for help. You are the only ones who answered." Okonkwo clasped 2 of his 4 hands in the greeting gesture her cultural briefing had taught her. "Elder Vornak, we come to offer whatever assistance we can provide. Our fleet is small and our chances are not favorable, but we could not remain silent while innocent people faced extinction." The Elder's large eyes glistened with something that might have been tears. "We know what you are risking for us. We have accessed your information networks and learned about your species. You are young by galactic standards, barely emerging into space, still building your first true warships, and yet you bring everything you have to help strangers." "Not strangers anymore," Okonkwo replied quietly. "The moment you asked for help, you became people we have a duty to protect." The refugee ships continued on toward the edges of known space, toward temporary sanctuaries that might become permanent homes if the Caleth species survived the coming days. The human fleet continued forward, toward the 5 remaining Caleth worlds and the 12,000 Vraxon vessels that surrounded them. As they approached the border of Caleth space, long-range sensors began detecting the full scope of the Vraxon fleet. Commander Rivera studied the tactical display with the dispassionate eye of someone who had already accepted his death and was now only concerned with making it count for something. The Vraxon forces were arranged in a standard siege formation, methodically reducing orbital defenses before beginning the final bombardment of the surface. "Admiral," he reported, "sensors are detecting massive energy signatures consistent with planetary bombardment. The Vraxon fleet is already engaging the 4th colony world. Estimated population of 300 million. Current casualty projections suggest complete extinction within 18 hours. Okonkwo's jaw tightened. "Increase speed to maximum. I want to reach engagement range within 4 hours. All ships are to prepare for immediate combat upon arrival." "And Commander," she added, her voice carrying to every station on the bridge, "when we enter Caleth space, we do so with the understanding that we may not leave it. Make sure every member of this crew knows that they are about to become part of something larger than themselves." Rivera nodded and began relaying orders throughout the fleet. Around him, his crew worked with focused efficiency, each person understanding their role in the coming battle. They were not heroes in the traditional sense, not soldiers seeking glory or warriors craving combat. They were ordinary people who had been asked a simple question: "Will you help someone who is dying even if helping them might kill you?" And they had answered yes. The human fleet crossed into Caleth space exactly 4 hours and 17 minutes later. Immediately, every Vraxon sensor array in the system locked onto the new arrivals, analyzing their capabilities and threat level. On the bridge of the Vraxon command ship Endless Dominion, Fleet Commander Zeril observed the human vessels with something approaching amusement. "What pitiful species has decided to interfere in Vraxon affairs?" he asked his sensor officer. "The database identifies them as humans, Commander, a recently spacefaring species from the third spiral arm. They possess limited faster-than-light capability and conventional fusion-based weapons. Military strength assessment. Negligible." Gerald's mandibles clicked together in the Vraxon equivalent of laughter. "They bring 180 vessels against 12,000. Either they are the bravest species in the galaxy, or the most foolish." He activated his communication systems, preparing to offer the humans a chance to retreat before he destroyed them. It would be entertaining to see which choice they made. But before he could transmit, his communication officer interrupted with an urgent message. "Commander, we are receiving a transmission from the human fleet. It is being broadcast on all frequencies, including channels used by the Kaleth survivors." "Play it," Zeril ordered, curious to hear what these newcomers had to say. Admiral Okonkwo's face appeared on every screen in the Vraxon fleet, her expression calm and her voice steady. "This is Admiral Sarah Okonkwo of the United Earth Fleet. We have entered Kaleth space in response to a request for humanitarian assistance. We demand that all Vraxon forces cease hostilities immediately and withdraw from this system." The laughter from the Vraxon bridges was audible even through the communication channels. Zeril composed himself and activated his own transmission. "I am Fleet Commander Zeril of the Vraxon Dominion. You are either ignorant or insane to make such demands. You are outnumbered more than 60 to 1. You possess inferior technology and no tactical advantage. I will offer you one opportunity to retreat beyond the system boundary. Refuse, and I will add human debris to the Kaleth wreckage already floating in this space." Okonkwo's expression did not change. "Fleet Commander Zeril, you misunderstand our purpose here. We did not come to negotiate. We did not come to make demands we expect you to honor. We came to teach you something that apparently the galaxy has forgotten. And what lesson could a primitive species possibly teach the Vraxon Dominion?" Zeril asked, genuinely curious now. The Admiral's eyes hardened with an intensity that made even the Vraxon commander pause. "We came to teach you what happens when you make the monsters of Earth choose between their own safety and protecting innocent lives. We came to show you that some species still believe mercy matters more than power. We came to remind the galaxy that barbarism has consequences." She leaned closer to the camera, and her next words were spoken with absolute certainty. "Fleet Commander Zeril, you are about to learn why humans became the apex predators on a world that tried to kill us for 3 billion years. You are about to discover what we are capable of when someone begs for mercy, and we decide to answer. Your fleet is larger and your weapons are stronger, but you have made one fatal mistake." "What mistake?" Zeril demanded, his amusement fading into something closer to unease. "You assumed we came here to win," Okonkwo replied. "We did not. We came here to make sure you never forget the price of genocide. And that, Commander, is a mission we will complete regardless of how many of us die in the process." The transmission ended. For a moment, silence filled the bridge of the Endless Dominion as Zeril processed what he had just heard. Then he shook himself and began issuing orders to his fleet. It did not matter what the humans believed or what they were willing to sacrifice. Numbers were numbers and physics was physics. The battle would be over in minutes. But as the human fleet began its final approach toward the Vraxon positions, moving with a speed and determination that suggested they had no intention of retreating, Zeril felt something he had not experienced in decades of conquest. It was the faint, uncomfortable sensation of doubt. And behind that doubt was an even more disturbing thought. What kind of species travels across the galaxy to die for strangers? He was about to find out. The Battle of Kaleth was about to begin, and the galaxy would never be the same. When monsters awaken, the first human ship to die was the UES Courage, a destroyer-class vessel commanded by Captain Maria Santos. She had served in Earth's Navy for 18 years, rising through the ranks through competence and an unshakable commitment to protecting those who could not protect themselves. When the Vraxon fleet opened fire with their long-range plasma batteries, the Courage was at the forward edge of the human formation, exactly where Santos had positioned her ship. The plasma bolt struck the Courage's forward shields with enough force to light up space for thousands of kilometers. The shields held for precisely 4 seconds before collapsing, and then the superheated plasma began eating through the hull plating. On the bridge, Santos watched her damage control board light up with critical failures as fires spread through 3 decks and her main reactor began destabilizing. All hands. "This is the captain," she announced over the ship-wide communication system. Her voice remarkably calm considering she had perhaps 90 seconds to live. "It has been my honor to serve with you. You are the finest crew in the fleet, and I want you to know that what we do today will echo across the stars for generations. Do not be afraid. We chose this mission knowing the cost. We chose to be the kind of people who help strangers because that is what humans do." She turned to her helmsman, Lieutenant Chen, whose hands were steady on the controls despite the ship shaking itself apart around them. "Chen, I need maximum acceleration toward that Vraxan dreadnought at coordinates 479. Divert all remaining power to engines." "Captain," Chen replied, understanding immediately what she was ordering. "That will leave us completely defenseless. We will not survive the approach." "We are not surviving anyway," Santos said gently, "but we can make our deaths matter. That dreadnought is their command ship for this sector. If we take it out, we create confusion in their formation. We give the rest of our fleet a chance." The Courage's engines flared to maximum thrust, pushing the dying vessel toward the massive Vraxan warship that dominated the tactical display. The dreadnought's point defense systems opened fire, raking the human destroyer with kinetic rounds that punched through armor like paper. Compartments decompressed, crew members died at their stations, and still the Courage continued forward. On the bridge of his flagship, Fleet Commander Zeril watched the human ship's suicidal approach with growing disbelief. "What are they doing? That vessel is already destroyed. Why did they not abandon ship?" His tactical officer had no answer that made sense. "The human crew is still at their stations, Commander. They are maintaining course and speed despite catastrophic damage. This does not match any known pattern of civilized warfare." The Courage struck the Vraxan dreadnought at 1,400 kilometers per second, her failing reactor detonating on impact. The explosion was visible from the surface of the nearest Kaleth colony world. A brief new star that marked the death of 147 human souls and the complete destruction of a warship that had taken the Vraxan Empire 3 years to build, but Captain Santos had been right about one thing. Her sacrifice created confusion in the Vraxan formation as ships moved to fill the gap left by their destroyed dreadnought. And in that moment of confusion, the rest of the human fleet struck. Admiral Okonkwo had not come to Kaleth space to fight a conventional battle. She had come to introduce the Vraxan Dominion to a type of warfare they had never experienced. Combat waged by a species that measured success not in ships preserved, but in enemy vessels destroyed. Not in tactical advantages gained, but in innocence protected. She had come to show them what total war looked like when fought by people who refused to acknowledge that some costs were too high to pay. "All ships, implement Berserker Protocol," she ordered, her voice carrying to every vessel in the human fleet. "You know your targets. You know your mission. Make every shot count. Make every death meaningful. Show them what humans do when mercy is requested." Berserker Protocol was not a tactic found in any military database. It violated every principle of force preservation and strategic warfare that had governed galactic conflicts for millennia. It was based on a simple, terrifying concept. Human ships would not retreat, would not attempt to preserve themselves, would not follow any of the expected rules of engagement. They would fight until destroyed, and they would take as many enemy vessels with them as possible. The UES Defiant, Commander Rivera's ship, led a squadron of 8 destroyers directly into the heart of the Vraxan formation. Conventional tactics would have called for maintaining distance and using long-range weapons to gradually wear down enemy forces. Instead, Rivera ordered his ships to close to point-blank range where their lighter weapons could target the weak points in Vraxan armor that his engineers had identified from captured technical specifications. The Q Gambit was insanely dangerous. At close range, the superior Vraxan weapons could tear through human ships in seconds. But Rivera had calculated that surprise and aggression might compensate for inferior firepower, at least long enough to inflict serious damage. His squadron dove into the Vraxan fleet like wolves attacking a herd, targeting engines, weapon systems, and command structures with focused precision. The UES Relentless, her forward section completely destroyed, rammed a Vraxan cruiser with enough force to crack the alien vessel's spine. The UES Vengeance, engines failing and life support offline, fired her last torpedoes into a cluster of enemy destroyers before exploding in a cascade of secondary detonations. The UES Justice, her crew already dead from radiation exposure, was guided by her AI system into a Vraxon carrier, destroying both vessels and the 40 fighter craft the carrier had been preparing to launch. And throughout the battle, Admiral Okonkwo maintained a constant broadcast on all frequencies. Every human sacrifice, every enemy ship destroyed, every act of defiance was transmitted across the galaxy for all species to witness. She was not just fighting a battle, she was sending a message that would resonate far beyond this single star system. People of the galaxy. Her voice rang out between combat reports and casualty updates. You are witnessing the cost of mercy. You are seeing what happens when one species decides that protecting the innocent matters more than protecting themselves. The Vraxon Dominion believes that power gives them the right to exterminate those weaker than themselves. Today, humans are proving them wrong. On the surface of the besieged Kaleth colony world, millions of civilians huddled in shelters and watched the battle unfolding in orbit through whatever communication systems still functioned. They saw human ships dying by the dozens, saw crews sacrifice themselves without hesitation, saw a level of commitment to strangers that defied logical explanation, and they wept for the beings who had crossed the stars to die for them. Elder Vornak, who had remained in the system to coordinate evacuation efforts, watched the battle from a command bunker deep beneath the capital city. Beside him stood his daughter, Serena, who had spent her entire life studying galactic civilizations and their various approaches to warfare. She was staring at the tactical displays with an expression of absolute shock. "Father," she whispered, "I have studied military history for 20 years. I have analyzed thousands of battles across hundreds of species. I have never seen anything like this. The humans are not trying to win. They are trying to inflict maximum damage before they die." Vornak's 4 hands trembled as another human vessel disappeared from the display. "They are trying to save us," he replied quietly, "and they are willing to pay any price to do so." How does a civilization produce such beings? What kind of world creates people who will die for strangers without hesitation? Fleet Commander Zero was asking himself the same question. In 3 hours of combat, his fleet had destroyed 93 human vessels. By any conventional measure, he was winning decisively. But his own casualties were staggering, far beyond anything he had experienced in decades of conquest. The humans had destroyed over 400 Vraxon ships, targeting command vessels and support craft with tactical precision that suggested careful planning rather than desperate improvisation. More disturbing than the casualties was the psychological impact on his forces. Vraxon warriors were trained to fight efficiently and ruthlessly, to follow orders and maintain formation discipline. They were not prepared for an enemy that viewed their own deaths as acceptable tools to achieve their objectives. They were not equipped to handle opponents who celebrated successful ramming actions as victories equal to any conventional engagement. "Commander," his communications officer reported with barely concealed fear in his voice, "we are receiving reports from multiple vessels requesting permission to withdraw. Morale is deteriorating rapidly. The crews are calling the humans death seekers and expressing concern about prolonged engagement." Gerald wanted to deny the withdrawal requests, to order his fleet to maintain their positions and finish destroying the human forces. But he was also a practical commander who understood that psychological defeats could be as damaging as physical ones. His fleet outnumbered the humans more than 10 to 1 even after the losses they had sustained. But his warriors were beginning to fear an enemy that should have been beneath their notice. "Pull back to maximum weapons range," he finally ordered. "Establish defensive formation and engage with long-range systems only. Do not, under any circumstances, allow human vessels to close to boarding distance." The Vraxon fleet began withdrawing, maintaining continuous fire as they retreated, but clearly prioritizing survival over aggressive engagement. It was the first time in living memory that a Vraxon force had retreated from an inferior enemy, and every species monitoring the battle recognized the significance of that fact. Admiral Okonkwo watched the Vraxon withdrawal with grim satisfaction. Her fleet was down to 71 functional vessels, less than 40% of her starting force. Her casualties numbered in the thousands. Good people who had died far from home in defense of beings they had never met. But the Vraxon fleet was hurting. Their formation was disrupted, and most importantly, they were afraid. "All ships," she broadcast to her remaining forces, "the enemy is withdrawing. This is not a victory, not yet. But it is proof that they can be hurt. It is evidence that their power is not absolute." and it is a message to every species in the galaxy that resistance is possible. She activated a new communication channel, this one directed at the Kaleth population. People of Kaleth, this is Admiral Sarah Okonkwo of Earth. We came here because you asked for help. We have paid a terrible price and we will likely pay more before this is over. But I want you to know that every human who has died today did so willingly. We chose this mission. We volunteered for this fight. Because we believe that some things are worth dying for, and protecting innocent people from genocide is one of them. The response from the Kaleth homeworld was immediate and overwhelming. Millions of messages flooded human communication channels. Expressions of gratitude and disbelief, prayers in alien languages, and tears shed for beings from another world. But the most significant response came from an unexpected source. Admiral, Lieutenant Kim reported from her communication station, I am receiving transmissions from multiple species across the galaxy. It appears our broadcast of the battle has spread far beyond the Kaleth system. We are being contacted by civilizations requesting more information about humanity and our intentions here. How many species? Okonkwo asked. Kim checked her systems twice before answering, her voice filled with wonder. Admiral, we are receiving communications from 47 different species, including several that are offering military assistance if we need it. For the first time since the battle began, Okonkwo allowed herself a slight smile. Transmit our appreciation to all species offering support. Tell them that humanity fights not for conquest or territory, but for the simple principle that innocent people deserve protection. Tell them that any species that shares that belief is welcome to join us in defending the Kaleth. On the bridge of the Endless Dominion, Fleet Commander Gerald received reports that 3 alien fleets were now approaching Kaleth space, having departed their home systems immediately after witnessing the human sacrifice. His tactical officer estimated that within 24 hours, his numerical advantage would disappear entirely as fresh forces arrived to join the human cause. Gerald had commanded fleets for 30 years. He had conquered 19 worlds and subjugated 7 species. He had never retreated from a battle, never failed to complete a mission assigned by the Vraxen High Command. But as he watched the tactical display show more and more ships converging on Kaleth space, he realized that something fundamental had changed in the galaxy. The humans had done more than hurt his fleet. They had shattered the illusion of Vraxon invincibility. They had proven that a smaller force with sufficient determination could inflict devastating casualties on a superior enemy. Most dangerous of all, they had inspired other species to stand against the Dominion, creating the possibility of a genuine coalition that could threaten Vraxon's supremacy. Open a channel to Admiral Okonkwo, he ordered quietly. It is time to negotiate terms. But before the communication could be established, his sensors detected multiple new arrivals at the edge of the system. The promised reinforcements had arrived early, and they were not just 3 fleets. 7 different species had sent ships to join the humans in defending the Kaleth, creating a combined force that now outnumbered the Vraxen fleet. Commander Rivera watched the new arrivals with emotions too complex to name. Relief that his people would not have to face the Vraxen alone. Sadness for the friends who had died before help could arrive. Pride that humanity's sacrifice had accomplished exactly what Admiral Okonkwo had intended, inspiring others to act. The galaxy watched what we did, he said to his bridge crew, and they decided to join us. That is the legacy of everyone who died today. They proved that courage is contagious and that standing against evil is possible. As the combined fleet arranged itself for a renewed assault on the Vraxen positions, Fleet Commander Gerald made the most difficult decision of his career. He ordered a complete withdrawal from Kaleth space, abandoning the conquest that had cost thousands of Vraxon lives and untold resources. His fleet would retreat, regroup, and face the consequences of their first genuine military defeat in decades. But as his ships began their faster-than-light transition out of the system, Gerald looked one last time at the human vessels still holding position above the Kaleth worlds. The humans had won, not through superior technology or greater numbers, but through something far more powerful. They had won because they were willing to die for strangers, and that willingness had inspired an entire galaxy to stand with them. The monsters of Earth had answered the call for mercy. And in doing so, they had changed everything. The galaxy remembers Admiral Sarah Okonkwo died 3 days after the Vraxen withdrawal, not in battle, but from injuries sustained when her flagship took direct hits during the final Vraxan assault before their retreat. She had remained at her post throughout the engagement, refusing medical treatment until the enemy was gone, and the Kaleth worlds were secure. Only then did she allow herself to collapse, her body finally acknowledging the trauma it had endured. Commander Rivera was at her bedside in the medical bay when she opened her eyes for the last time. Around them, the UES Defiant continued its patrol above the Kaleth homeworld, one of only 47 human vessels that had survived the battle. The cost had been devastating. Over 8,000 human lives lost, 133 ships destroyed or damaged beyond repair. But the Kaleth species still existed, and that fact alone made the sacrifice worthwhile. "Commander," Okonkwo's voice was barely above a whisper, but her eyes were still sharp and focused. "Status report." Rivera leaned closer, his own injuries wrapped in medical bandages that did little to hide the extent of his wounds. "The Kaleth worlds are secure, Admiral. The Vraxan fleet retreated to their primary strongholds in the Nexus sector. 7 allied species have established defensive positions throughout the system. The Kaleth population is safe." Okonkwo closed her eyes for a moment, relief evident on her face despite the pain she must have been experiencing. "Good. That is good. Tell me, Commander, do you regret coming here? Do you wish we had stayed home where it was safe?" Rivera shook his head slowly. "No, Admiral. I have lost friends and witnessed horrors I will never forget, but I would make the same choice again without hesitation. What we did here mattered. We showed the galaxy that some things are more important than survival." The Admiral's hand reached out and gripped his with surprising strength. "Make sure they remember, James. Make sure the galaxy knows why we came here and what we were willing to sacrifice. Do not let our deaths be forgotten or dismissed as the actions of foolish primitives. We came here because mercy matters, because protecting the innocent is not optional for civilized beings, because humans refuse to live in a universe where genocide goes unanswered. I promise, Admiral, your sacrifice will never be forgotten." Okonkwo's grip relaxed and her breathing began to slow. With her final words, spoken so quietly that Rivera had to lean close to hear them, she delivered one last order. "Tell Earth, tell our families, tell anyone who asks, we did not die in vain. We proved that humans are exactly what we have always been, the species that helps strangers because it is the right thing to do." She died peacefully, surrounded by crew members who had served with her for years. The news of her death spread through the fleet within minutes, and within hours it had reached Earth. Across the planet, billions of humans mourned the loss of a leader who had embodied the best qualities of their species. But they also celebrated her legacy, the proof that humanity could be judged by its willingness to protect the vulnerable rather than exploit the weak. The memorial service was held on the surface of the Kaleth homeworld, in the capital city that would have been destroyed if not for human intervention. Representatives from 9 species attended, standing alongside human survivors and Kaleth civilians to honor the fallen. The ceremony was broadcast across the galaxy, watched by trillions of beings who were still processing the implications of what they had witnessed. Elder Vornak stood at the memorial podium, his forearms trembling with emotion as he gazed out at the assembled crowd. Behind him rose a monument of crystalline stone, etched with the names of every human who had died defending Kaleth space. The monument would stand for millennia, a permanent reminder of the day strangers became saviors. "I am not skilled with words," Vornak began, his translator rendering his speech into dozens of languages simultaneously. "My people are traders and artists, philosophers and dreamers. We built our civilization on the belief that reason and compassion were sufficient to navigate the dangers of the galaxy. We were wrong. When the Vraxan came with fire and death, our reason meant nothing. Our compassion could not stop their weapons." He paused, looking at the human survivors who sat in the front rows, their faces marked by grief and exhaustion. "We sent our message to 47 civilized species. We begged for help from governments with vast fleets and ancient military traditions. Every one of them calculated the cost and decided we were not worth saving. Everyone except humanity. The humans came from a young species, barely a presence in galactic affairs. They came with a small fleet and outdated weapons. They came knowing they would probably die. They came anyway because we asked for mercy, and they decided that was enough reason to cross the stars." Vornak's voice broke, and he had to pause for several moments before continuing. 8,000 humans died defending my people. 8,000 individuals with families and dreams and futures they sacrificed for strangers they never met. How do you thank someone for such a gift? How do you honor such a sacrifice? The answer is that you cannot. You can only promise to remember, and to live in a way that proves their deaths had meaning. He turned to face the human delegation directly. To the people of Earth I make this promise on behalf of every Kaleth who draws breath. We will never forget what you did for us. We will teach our children about the day humanity answered our call. We will tell the story of Admiral Okonkwo and Captain Santos and Commander Rivera, and every human who proved that courage and compassion can coexist. And we will strive every day to be worthy of the sacrifice you made for us. The Kaleth in attendance began a traditional morning song, a haunting melody that had been sung at funerals for thousands of years. But this time the song was not just for Kaleth dead. It was for humans who had become part of Kaleth history, forever woven into the story of a species that survived extinction because strangers chose mercy over safety. Commander Rivera stood and walked to the podium as Vornak stepped aside. He was now the ranking human officer in the system, a responsibility he had never wanted but could not refuse. His voice was steady as he addressed the crowd, though his heart was heavy with loss. Admiral Okonkwo's final order to me was to make sure the galaxy remembers why we came here. So I will tell you plainly what humanity believes, what we have always believed even in our darkest moments. We believe that civilization is not measured by technological advancement or military power. It is measured by how we treat those who cannot defend themselves. He gestured toward the monument behind him. These names represent humans from every nation on Earth. Different cultures, different languages, different beliefs about almost everything except one fundamental principle. When someone asks for help, you help them if you can. It does not matter if they are strangers. It does not matter if helping them is dangerous or expensive or likely to end badly. You help because refusing to help means surrendering your humanity. The Vraxan Dominion believed that might makes right, that the strong can do whatever they want to the weak. They were wrong. Strength without mercy is not power, it is tyranny. And tyranny eventually faces resistance from people who decide that some things are worth fighting for, even when the odds are impossible. Rivera's voice grew stronger, carrying across the assembly and through the broadcast systems that relayed his words across the galaxy. Today we honor the dead. Tomorrow we begin building something new, a galaxy where genocide has consequences, where aggressive empires face opposition from species united by common values, where the strong protect the weak, not because they must, but because they choose to. The response to Rivera's speech was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, 17 species had formally requested membership in what was being called the Terran Accord, a defensive alliance based on the principle that protecting innocent populations was a shared responsibility of all civilized species. Within days, that number had grown to 34 species, representing nearly 40% of the known galactic community. The political implications were staggering. For thousands of years, galactic civilization had been divided into competing power blocks, each pursuing their own interests with little concern for smaller or weaker species. The Vraxan Dominion had been one of the largest such blocks, maintaining control through fear and the assumption that no coalition could effectively challenge them. The Battle of Kaleth had shattered that assumption and created the possibility of a new type of galactic order. But not everyone welcomed the changes humanity had unleashed. In the Vraxan capital of Nexus Prime, the High Command convened an emergency session to address their humiliating defeat. Fleet Commander Gerald stood before the council, his career and possibly his life hanging in the balance as he explained how a primitive species with inferior technology had forced the mighty Vraxan fleet to retreat. The humans did not fight like civilized beings, he reported, his voice carefully neutral. They showed no concern for casualty ratios or strategic positioning. They used their own ships as weapons, their own deaths as tactics. They broadcast their sacrifice across the galaxy and turned military defeat into propaganda victory. Most critically, they inspired other species to overcome their fear and stand against us. Supreme Commander Krath, a veteran of 50 years of conquest, studied the battle recordings with growing unease. These humans trouble me, not because they are strong, clearly they are not, but because they have introduced a concept that could undermine everything we have built. They have shown the galaxy that resistance is possible if one is willing to pay the price. The council debated for hours, some members calling for immediate retaliation against Earth, others arguing for a more measured response. Finally, Krath raised his hand for silence and delivered his judgment. We will not attack Earth directly. Such an action would only create martyrs and further inspire resistance across the galaxy. Instead, we will withdraw from our most exposed positions and consolidate our forces in our core territories. We will rebuild our strength and wait for this wave of human-inspired idealism to fade, as all such movements eventually do. But the movement did not fade. 6 months after the Battle of Kaleth, the Terran Accord had grown to include 53 species, and human vessels were patrolling key trade routes throughout Allied space. The galaxy had not become peaceful overnight. Conflicts and disputes still erupted regularly. But aggressive expansion by major powers had become far more difficult now that smaller species could call for assistance and expect to receive it. The transformation was particularly evident on worlds that had been under Vraxan occupation. Inspired by the human example, resistance movements that had been dormant for decades suddenly came back to life. On Gordath Prime, rebels destroyed 3 Vraxan military installations in coordinated attacks. On Thessaly Minor, civilians refused to cooperate with occupation forces, engaging in passive resistance that gradually made the planet ungovernable. The Vraxan response was brutal and predictable. They executed civilians, destroyed infrastructure, and broadcast their retaliation as warnings to other worlds. But instead of terrorizing populations into submission, the violence only strengthened the resistance and drew more species to the Terran Accord. Every Vraxan atrocity created new martyrs, and every martyr inspired more people to stand against tyranny. The breaking point came when footage emerged from Gordath Prime, showing Vraxan forces executing children in retaliation for rebel attacks. The images spread across the galaxy within hours, and the response was immediate and overwhelming. 17 species that had remained neutral in the conflict suddenly declared their support for the resistance. The Altarian Federation, one of the galaxy's oldest and most powerful civilizations, formally recognized the Terran Accord and pledged military support for any member species facing aggression. Within Earth's command center in Geneva, now relocated to a massive orbital station above the planet, military planners worked around the clock to coordinate the growing coalition. Commander Rivera, promoted to admiral after Okonkwo's death, found himself leading not just human forces but a truly galactic fleet, comprising vessels from dozens of species. The diversity presented challenges. Different species had different combat doctrines, different communication protocols, different ideas about acceptable casualties and rules of engagement. But they also shared something fundamental, a belief that the strong had a duty to protect the weak, and that belief proved sufficient to overcome most practical obstacles. Admiral Rivera stood before a holographic display showing the current disposition of Terran Accord forces throughout the galaxy. Beside him was General Yara Ose of the African Union, who had been appointed as his second-in-command. Together they were planning the next phase of operations against Vraxan holdings. The problem is not defeating them militarily, Ose observed, highlighting several Vraxan strongholds on the display. Our combined fleet now outnumbers them significantly, and our tactics have proven effective. The problem is what happens after we win. How do we ensure that we do not simply replace one empire with another? Rivera nodded thoughtfully. That is why Admiral Okonkwo insisted we broadcast everything, Yara. She wanted the galaxy to see not just our victories, but our principles. We help species defend themselves, then we leave. We do not occupy, we do not impose governments, we do not take resources as payment for our assistance. But surely Earth gains something from all this, Ose replied. We have spent enormous resources building and maintaining this fleet. We have lost thousands of lives. At some point, our own people will ask what we are getting in return. What we get is the kind of galaxy we want to live in, Rivera said simply. One where genocide is not tolerated, where aggressive empires face consequences, where humans can look at themselves in the mirror and know they stood for something that mattered. That is not nothing, Yara. That is everything. The offensive against the Vraxan Dominion began 3 months later with simultaneous operations in 7 star systems. Terran Accord forces did not attempt to conquer Vraxan territory. Instead, they liberated occupied worlds and destroyed military installations while carefully avoiding civilian casualties. The strategy was designed to demonstrate that the Accord's power would be used defensively rather than aggressively, protecting populations rather than subjugating them. The Vraxon fought desperately to maintain their empire, but they were no longer facing a single enemy they could intimidate or overwhelm. They were facing a coalition united by shared values and inspired by the human sacrifice at Kaleth. Every battle they won came at tremendous cost. Every population they terrorized drove more species to join the resistance. The war lasted 18 months. In the end, the Vraxon High Command sued for peace, accepting terms that dismantled their empire and placed their military under international oversight. It was an unprecedented outcome in galactic history. A major power forced to surrender not through conquest, but through the combined pressure of species that refused to tolerate their aggression. The peace treaty was signed aboard a human vessel in neutral space, with representatives from 90 species present to witness the moment. Supreme Commander Krath placed his seal on the document with barely concealed fury, but he had no choice. His fleets were broken, his allies had abandoned him, and his people faced complete destruction if he continued fighting. "This is not over," he said to Admiral Rivera as the ceremony concluded. "Empires rise and fall. Today you are victorious, but tomorrow the galaxy may tire of your idealism and return to more practical arrangements." Rivera met his gaze without flinching. "Perhaps you are right. Perhaps someday the galaxy will forget what happened at Kaleth. Perhaps future generations will decide that protecting strangers is too expensive or too dangerous. But that day is not today, and as long as humans have ships and soldiers willing to serve, we will remember why we came to this galaxy. We will remember that mercy matters." The treaty established what became known as the Galactic Protection Compact, a framework for responding to genocide and crimes against civilian populations. Any species facing extinction could appeal to the compact, and member nations were obligated to provide assistance. The system was not perfect. Political considerations still influenced responses, and not every species chose to participate. But it represented a fundamental shift in how galactic civilization approached questions of power and responsibility. 5 years after the Battle of Kaleth, Commander James Rivera retired from military service and returned to Earth. He was 52 years old, decorated with honors from 30 species, and tired in ways that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. He had seen too many friends die, made too many impossible decisions, carried too much responsibility for too many years. He settled in a small house in the mountains of Peru, as far from spaceports and military bases as he could manage. He thought he would spend his retirement trying to forget the war, trying to heal from wounds both visible and invisible. Instead, he found himself writing, recording the stories of the people he had served with, ensuring their sacrifices would not be lost to time. The book he eventually published was titled simply, "They Asked for Mercy." It became required reading in military academies across 40 species, studied by historians and philosophers, quoted by politicians and activists. But Rivera's favorite responses came from ordinary people, civilians who wrote to tell him that reading about the Battle of Kaleth had inspired them to help their neighbors, to stand against injustice in their own communities, to believe that individual actions could matter. One letter particularly moved him. It came from a young Kaleth woman named Serena, daughter of Elder Vornak. She wrote about growing up in a world that had been saved by strangers, about learning human languages and studying human history, about dedicating her life to the principles that had motivated humans to cross the galaxy to help her people. Admiral Rivera, her letter read, "I was 12 years old when your fleet arrived in our system. I remember watching the battle from shelters beneath our capital city. I remember my father weeping as human ships died protecting us. I remember thinking that if beings from another world could be so brave, so selfless, so willing to sacrifice for strangers, then perhaps the galaxy was not as dark as the Vraxon had taught us to believe. Because of what humanity did, I chose to dedicate my life to protecting others. I joined the Kaleth Defense Force, and I now serve as a liaison officer with the Terran Accord Fleet. Every day, I work alongside humans and other species to ensure that what happened to my people never happens to anyone else. Your sacrifice gave me not just life, but purpose. That is what we fought for," Rivera thought as he read the letter again. "Not territory or resources or political advantage. We fought so that young people across the galaxy could grow up believing that mercy matters, that protecting the innocent is not optional, that courage and compassion can coexist. 10 years after Admiral Okonkwo died defending Calith space, her legacy was visible throughout the galaxy. The Terran Accord had grown to include 117 species. Aggressive expansion by major powers had declined dramatically, as potential aggressors calculated the cost of facing a unified coalition. Smaller species no longer lived in constant fear of being conquered or exterminated because they knew help was available if they asked for it. On Earth, a new generation was coming of age that had never known a galaxy without the Terran Accord. They studied the Battle of Calith in schools, learned about Admiral Okonkwo and Captain Santos and the 8,000 humans who had died, proving that mercy mattered. Some of them joined the military, inspired by stories of human courage. Others became diplomats, engineers, teachers, carrying human values into every corner of known space. The monument on the Calith homeworld had become a pilgrimage site, visited by millions of beings from hundreds of species. They came to see the names etched in crystalline stone, to pay respects to humans who had died for strangers, to remind themselves that civilization was defined by how it treated the vulnerable. Elder Vornak, now ancient by Calith standards, still visited the monument every day. He had outlived most of his generation, surviving to see his grandchildren and great-grandchildren grow up in a galaxy that remembered human sacrifice. On his final visit, just weeks before his own death, he was accompanied by his daughter Serena and her young son, a child who bore a human name in honor of the species that had saved his people. "Tell me again, grandfather," the child asked, looking up at the towering monument. "Tell me about the humans who came when no one else would." Vornak smiled and placed one hand on his grandson's shoulder. "They came from a world called Earth," he began, repeating the story he had told countless times. "They were not the strongest species in the galaxy, not the most advanced, not the most powerful, but they were the bravest because they understood something that many species had forgotten. They understood that true strength is using power to protect those who cannot protect themselves." The child listened with wide eyes as his grandfather described the battle, the sacrifice, the moment when Admiral Okonkwo had chosen to cross the galaxy, knowing she would probably die. When the story finished, the child had one more question. "Will the humans always protect us, grandfather? Will they always come when someone needs help?" Vornak looked at the monument, at the names of 8,000 humans who had proven their commitment with their lives. "I believe they will," he said quietly, "because protecting others is not just what humans do. It is who they are. They showed us that mercy is not weakness, that compassion is not foolishness, that some things are worth dying for. And as long as the galaxy remembers that lesson, humans will continue to be the monsters that nightmares fear." On Earth, in a ceremony broadcast across the galaxy, a new class of vessels was christened. They were exploration ships, not warships, designed to seek out new civilizations and offer friendship rather than conquest. The lead ship of the class was named the Sarah Okonkwo, ensuring that the Admiral's legacy would travel to the furthest reaches of space. At the christening ceremony, the current head of the United Earth Council delivered a speech that echoed Admiral Okonkwo's final message. "We name this vessel for a woman who proved that humans are defined by our choices, not our circumstances. She chose mercy over safety. She chose sacrifice over survival. She chose to believe that protecting strangers was worth any price. That is the legacy we carry forward as we explore the galaxy, not as conquerors or colonizers, but as beings committed to the principle that civilization means protecting the vulnerable." Deep in space, on the bridge of a Terran Accord patrol vessel, alarms suddenly blared. Sensors had detected a distress call from an uncharted system, a species the Coalition had never contacted, begging for help against an aggressor force. The ship's captain, a human woman named Commander Lisa Santos, daughter of the Captain Maria Santos who had died at Calith, did not hesitate. Set course for the source of that transmission. She ordered her mixed species crew. "Maximum speed. Someone just asked for mercy, and we are going to answer." As the ship engaged its faster-than-light drives and disappeared into the darkness, the crew prepared for whatever they would find. They did not know if they would survive the mission. They did not know if their intervention would make a difference. But they knew why they were going. Because humans had answered a call for mercy once before and changed the galaxy forever. The monsters of Earth had taught the universe that barbarism has consequences. that genocide faces resistance, that protecting innocent people is not optional for truly civilized beings. That lesson had echoed across the stars for a decade, inspiring species after species to choose courage over fear, principle over pragmatism, mercy over indifference, and as long as someone, somewhere in the vast darkness of space, cried out for help, humanity would answer, not because they were the strongest or the smartest or the most advanced, but because they were the species that had looked at impossible odds and decided that some things were worth dying for. The age of easy conquest was over. The age of guardians had begun, and the galaxy would never forget the day humans proved that mercy was not just an ideal, it was a force powerful enough to reshape civilization itself. In the end, the greatest weapon was not firepower or numbers or technology. It was the willingness of ordinary people to become extraordinary when someone asked for help. That was humanity's gift to the galaxy, the knowledge that heroes were not born, they were made through choices, and the right choice made by enough people could change everything. They had begged for mercy. Earth had sent its monsters, and those monsters had reminded the universe what it meant to be truly civilized. The story of the Battle of Kaleth would be told for thousands of years, passed down through generations of species who had been saved by human sacrifice. It would inspire songs and poems, laws and philosophies, acts of courage, small and large. It would become the defining moment when the galaxy learned that strength without mercy was tyranny. But mercy backed by strength could transform everything. And somewhere, in the darkness between stars, another cry for help was beginning its journey across the void, waiting for someone to hear it, waiting for someone to care enough to answer. The monsters of Earth were listening, and they would come. They would always come.